Okay, I'm with Mom on July 11th, 2020, and I'm going to ask her about people in her life. Just let her ramble on about the first thing that comes to her head. No right or wrong answers, and we'll just see memories about people. These can be good or bad. Um, we just won't tell the bad ones to those people directly. All right. Before we get started with her family, I do want her to talk about Dick Roop. You told me about this recently, and so I'm going to have you say it on tape.
Okay. Dick Roop was Russell's cousin. Oh, stop it.
Here. Okay. I'll put it over.
This would make me nervous.
Okay, just talk. Dick Roop was Russell's cousin.
Yes, and Dick had a rough time in life. He had been an illegitimate child that his stepfather was not willing to accept too well, and so he was kind of an outcast of the family. And so life was very difficult for him, and he ended up in a lot of trouble and in prison several times. I remember one time being in Fort Wayne, Indiana, visiting my grandma and my mother and my aunt, and we were watching television. And that's right, Grandma wasn't there, but Mother and Margie were there. And television came on, and the news came on with a big flash, and it said a big robbery in the bank in Fort Wayne. And my aunt had banked at that bank and was very excited and said, "Oh my goodness, what's going on here?" And they sat up real close to the TV to hear every little detail. And the fellow that had robbed the bank had gotten in a police chase and everything. And so as we're watching it, they said that the fellow's name was Dick Roop. And I went, "Oh my goodness, that's my cousin." And of course, Mother and Margie didn't believe me. And then I tried to explain to them that it was my cousin through Russell. And they were so nervous. And they said, "Oh, please don't tell anybody." They were very proper people, and they would not let anybody know. So I wasn't allowed to ever say anything in Fort Wayne, Indiana about Dick. Well, as it was, he went to prison again. And he went to prison because of another time when he was in a police chase, and police finally caught him. They shot through his window and hit his hand and shot his finger off, I think, and he wrecked. And so Russell and his cousin Ted, which is Dick's brother, decided to go to whatever state he was in prison and visit him. And he said he was about ready to get out. He says, "The next time when I'm out, I've learned my lesson. The next time I do try to rob a bank, I'm going to do it this way." So we knew that there was no hopes for Dick after that, and he spent much of his life in prison.
What was he doing in Fort Wayne?
I don't have any idea. He just happened to be in that area when he chose to rob a bank. It had nothing to do with the family.
But he's from?
Georgia. Well, he was from Akron.
Akron, okay.
Originally.
Bessie Wilson Rogers.
Bessie was my father's mother. And I wish I knew her better than I did, but she passed away before I was very old. And Grandpa married again, but I never did meet his second wife.
Do you know her name?
Suzanne. And Suzanne was unique from what I hear. One time Grandpa came to visit us, Grandpa Rogers came to visit us, and when Mother and Daddy and I lived in Cincinnati on Moonridge Drive, and he had been living in California, and Bessie was Bessie had died in California, and Suzanne was in California at the time. It was very, very bitter cold in Cincinnati, and so Grandpa came to visit us alone, and while he was here, he was just chilled to the bone, and he said, "I'm not going back to California until it warms up a little bit around here, because I don't want to go to the airport and all that in the cold." So he called Bessie, or I'm sorry, I keep getting them mixed up. He called Suzanne and told her that he wasn't going to come home for a week or so. And so she said, well, just go out and buy some long underwear. And he says, well, I can do that, but I'm not coming home for another week or two. She said, if you don't come home now, you'll never see me again. I will be gone. And when he returned back to California in a couple of weeks, he found that his home was totally empty of everything, and he never knew where she went.
Never saw her again?
Never saw her again.
Let's go back to Bessie. What else do you know about her?
I don't know anything else about Bessie other than I just remember her as being a very sweet lady and very well kept.
Okay. I'm doing these alphabetically here.
Okay.
Bob Slack.
Bob Slack was married to my sister's daughter, Debbie. And that was her first marriage. And with that marriage, she had 2 children, 2 boys. And they were Sean and, I know his name. I'm sorry, it won't come to me right now. But that marriage ended in divorce, so I lost track of him. Next one.
Camilla Rogers White.
Camilla was my father's sister. And again, those are relatives that I probably saw once or twice in my life. I do remember that they lived on the corner someplace, probably in Michigan. I don't even really, no, they were out west. Anyway, they lived on a corner with a fenced-in backyard. And her husband's nickname was Whitey. But the strange thing is, his face was as pink as could be, and I never could figure out why they called the pink-faced man Whitey. But it's his last name, so that's all I remember about them.
Cassandra Jones.
Cassandra was a foster child that came to our home, and whenever we received foster children, they usually would bring them in looking very, very unkept and unhappy and, just plain sad. And they would bring in a garbage bag full of clothes, which I learned to leave outside and never bring in the house. I usually threw everything away because nothing matched. It was usually dirty. It was just crud. But when Cassandra came to our house, she came with a very nice suitcase. Cassandra was a black child, and she had a mother that loved her and took her home and raised her for about 3 months. And after that, the grandparents were so embarrassed that their daughter had had a child out of wedlock and she was 16, or 15 or 16. And they said, you cannot keep her. Well, after she'd bonded with her for 3 months and then told her she had to get rid of her, I just always thought that was horrible. But the interesting thing about her is it was very obvious that she was very loved by her mother, because her suitcase was nothing but crisp, clean things that the mother had folded neatly and put in there with little notes on different items and what she liked to play with when she was laying someplace, or what she liked to eat, and all these things. And I thought, this child deserves her mother. So after a period of time, the mother, worked very hard to get a GED, and she finally got herself a job and an apartment, and she got the baby back. And I really rooted for her on that one. But I'd love to see that child again. She was a beautiful little girl.
Do you know anything about him?
I do know that, you mean...
Where they at today, or the mom's name, or
I
anything?
don't. I do know that after she left our house, for some reason or other, she went to a foster home for a short period of time. We have a picture of the people, and they had 2 or 3 other children. That was just a temporary place before she got to go back home.
You don't know any idea where she's at today?
I have no idea.
Delmer Rogers.
Delmer Rogers is my brother, my favorite brother, and I have many, many fond memories of Delmer. I don't know why I say I have fond memories. He picked on me all the time. I remember times when he and my sister Emily would stack up blocks in the middle of the living room, and they'd be taller than the chandelier. And then they'd tell me I could ride my bicycle into them, and it would hit the chandelier and everything, and the blocks would fall, and my mother and father came in, and Emily and Delmer were gone, and here I sat amongst all the blocks sitting on my bicycle. It seemed like they were able to set things up like that for me all the time, get me in trouble, but Delmer was a great guy. He did leave for college while I was still young. He was 11 years, 11 years older than me. And so he went off part of the time before he went to college. He went in ROTC, so he did a lot of trips with that. And then he went to Cincinnati Christian University. And while he was there, he met his wife at Joliet Church, where we were living at the time. And so he married right at the end of college. In fact, I think like the second week after college, after he graduated. And was married to Louise Wilfong. And they had 3 children, Cheryl, Gail, and Lauren. And Delmer was a minister and did a beautiful job with several churches. And then we ended up, he was living in Kentucky, and he got cancer and he passed away. And we were able to spend a lot of time together before he passed away because we were living in fairly the same area. So, but that was a hard thing to lose him.
Tell me about his inventions and creations and his mind.
That's unexplainable. Delmer was probably the most unique person I've ever known when it came to creating and doing stuff. He always carried 3x5 cards in his pocket, just like my dad did. But Delmer's was not always to help him remember who to go call on and who to call on the phone and stuff. His was every time he got an invention idea, he'd put it down on this little 3x5 card. Then if he'd come over for supper and stuff, he'd be sitting there and he'd talk for a few minutes, and then he'd get out his cards and he'd be inventing. And he was inventing all the time, and he came up with many unique ideas. One, for instance, he took when Louise had Alzheimer's. He wanted to go on a trip. He never kept her home and kept her, he made sure she went places all the time because he wanted to go places, and he was great on going on vacations. So this one time, he decided that he wanted to go to Disney World. So he got this wheelchair, which Louise could use it. She wasn't needing it all the time, but he wanted it because he knew that he could get in line first at Disney World. When you're in a wheelchair, you get to be taken in first. So, but he fixed it all up with a table that dropped down to the side of the handle. He put it so there was an umbrella that could open up, and it stuck on the back corner of the chair. He made a shelf underneath where he put canned goods and a tent. And so he would push Louise around. Sometimes she pushed him around Disney World. And then when they wanted to eat lunch, they would put the umbrella up, pull the table up. He had a little tiny camping folder chair underneath too, somehow. And he'd sit in front of her, and they would open their cans and they'd eat their lunch. And another time he made a camper. It was just a small little thing you pull behind a car, but he built it so that you would open up the top and it would drop down on the ground beside him and fill in a space on the ground, and it worked great. It was a double bed, and you had a place to stand and get dressed. He also invented a pill maker where you put for your invalid relatives or your elderly family. You put pills in for them at certain times, and then a buzzer would buzz when it was time for that person to take that. It would only open the box part that was to be used for that hour of pills. And then if if the person didn't take their pills for 2 times in a row, then it would call you on the phone and let you know that your parent or somebody had not taken their pills. And he got written up in the American Medical Association magazine of some kind for this wonderful invention, but he just didn't have enough money to make it happen. So that's the type of things he did that were.
Who did he work with on that?
Pardon?
Who did he work with on that?
Oh, he went everywhere. He went to hospitals. He talked to doctors. He talked to who are you thinking of?
Heimlich. Henry Heimlich.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. So Henry Heimlich had some pull, but it still took money to make it happen, and it didn't. So he was unique, but everybody loved him.
Dorothy Ream Banks.
Dorothy Banks was my mother's brother's Ralph, his wife, and they lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they had 2 children, Michael and Sharon. They lived in a beautiful home out in the country. They did very well. Ralph was a builder and learned a lot from my grandpa. So he worked for a large firm that built hospitals and stuff. So that was his job. I don't know whether Dorothy had a job or not. I was a kid then. That's all for.
You don't know much more about her?
Not a lot. I don't know her background. No.
Ermelie Rogers Downey Sears McCassin.
Which was all legal. Ermelie's my sister. She's 6 years older than me. Ermelie was a great sister. We shared a room for years. We had twin beds, and we lived right near a firehouse. And I remember every time the fire alarm would go off, I would jump in her bed, scared to death, because it was so loud near our house. One night, we were home alone on a Wednesday night. They didn't have Bible study for the kids. And so we were left in the house alone, and we were upstairs, and we heard somebody coming in the driveway. Well, we knew it wasn't time for Mother and Daddy, and besides that, it was a car, and we didn't own a car. So we went to the back window because they pulled into the backyard by the garage, and we watched out the window just peeking in the dark. And they got out of their car. It was 2 men. It was a little tiny black car with like 2 doors and a big trunk. And they got out of the car and they walked around to the back end of the car and they opened the trunk and put something in it, shut the trunk, and came to the side of our house where we had a door. And they opened the door and we were petrified. And we didn't move. And we knew the door was open because Mother and Daddy never shut it or never locked it, because the church knew that they could come in that door and get the keys to the church anytime they wanted them. Kept the church locked, but they didn't keep the parsonage locked. But anyway, we sat in the dark until Mother and Daddy came home. And they came home through the backyard, so they saw the car right away. They came in the house and couldn't find us for a few minutes because we weren't positive it was them yet. So anyway, they came upstairs and found us and said, "Do you know anything about the car in the backyard?" And we started crying and everything. We didn't know. Come to find out, one of the families in the church was giving my dad a car, and they had just brought it over there and dropped it in the backyard and put the keys in the side door for it. So that turned out to be an okay story, but a rough evening. But all through our lives, Emily and I have had lots of good times together. We were both pianists and piano teachers, and we sang, and we would do women's retreats where we would lead the singing, and one of us would play, one of us would lead, or one of us would speak. And we just had lots of fun doing that. We took Mother with us one time to North Women up in Michigan, and
What's North Women?
North Women is the opposite of Northmen, and that's up in Michigan. It's a gathering, something like what's the one you used to go to? Kiamichi Clinic, yeah. But there were hundreds of women that came from all over the United States and for this women's meeting. So we just had a great time, especially the time that Mother came and went with us. And we ran out of gas and ended up riding with some trucker people that from the program in the truck. And when we got there, it was the evening session, and people had known we ran out of gas. So I was sitting on the platform, about 13 to 15 women in a semicircle, and the main speaker was a woman from another country, and she spoke very broken English. I can't think of her name. But anyway, she leaned over in her seat and yelled down the other end to me and said, "You got gas?" And I said, "No. Do you smell something?" And the platform went crazy, and we got to giggling, and we couldn't even get the program started. But that's been a joke ever since that happened. All we have to do is say to one another, "You got gas?" and we lose it. So Emily was married to Jerry Downey for 18 years, and they had 4 children, 4 daughters, Debbie, Bev, Brenda, and Darla. And when the girls were still young, Jerry chose to go run off and marry his secretary, who was the choir director and the secretary of the church. And she was also an elder's wife. So the two of them ran off together. And following that, the elder that she'd been married to was feeling bad for my sister's girls, and so he would drive to Fort Wayne, where Emily was living at the time with her girls, and he would take them to football games and buy them stuff and everything. And they finally said, "Mom, please marry him. We like him." So she did. And they were married for quite some time until he got Parkinson's and he passed away. And then a few years later, she met, well, I guess she'd known him for a while, Mert McCassin, who's a fellow that we went to college with, also had been Donnie Benner's boss. And he was, I think, Emily's Sunday school teacher at church. Well, they married, and they've been married now for quite a few years, and somewhere 8 or 9 years, I think. And now she has Alzheimer's, and she's in a nursing home, and it's now during the COVID-19 pandemic, and from the time she was placed in the nursing home, they have had no visitations, none whatsoever. And this last week, they found out that somebody on her floor has the COVID, and she's now been confined to her room for 2 weeks alone. She's not a very happy person, so my heart's broken for her. So, and I can't even talk to her on the telephone.
Because they won't let you.
Because the home won't let us.
Any more about Emily?
Just that she was a great sister, my only sister. And I miss her.
Gail Sears.
Gail Sears was her second husband, and he was the elder that she was married to. And all I can say about him was he was a genuine, good Christian man, and he really, really was good to his Emily's girls, and they had a very good marriage.
You know anything about him?
He was a iron worker, I believe, and in Chicago area. I can't remember much more than that.
Gladys Banks Imler.
Gladys was my mother's sister. She moved to California when I was still young. She married my uncle. And I probably shouldn't say this on here, but her name was Gladys and her husband called her Happy Bottom. But anyway, they were chicken farmers in California in forgot the name of the town. Just a small town. Yucaipa, yeah. And I didn't get to see her a lot during the years, but I did get to see her enough that I knew her and loved her. And she was just as sweet as could be, a very classy woman. She had 2 daughters and a son, and Peggy and Gladys and Leslie, yes. And they're just a sweet family. I enjoyed them. We went to visit Gladys one time, and Russell and I did in California, and we were talking on Saturday night about whether we'd go to church where we'd go to church the next morning, and she told us that she attended the Church of Christ in her town. And so we happened to be telling her how everywhere we go, we see somebody we know. In fact, we had gone to Israel and saw 4 people we knew in Israel. So we were getting out of the car at church, walking towards the back of the building, and she said to me, "Who are you going to know at my church this morning?" I said, "Gladys, this is Yucaipa, California. I'm not going to know anybody here." And we walked around to the back, and there sat the Impact Brass and Singers bus from Ozark Bible College, which Roger and Jeffrey played for years. And we knew lots of people on the bus that night. So, yeah, we know somebody wherever we go. So, anyway, I didn't see Gladys in the latter years, so, but she was a sweet woman. Very much reminded me of my mother.
Anything else?
No, I don't know anything else.
Homer Banks.
I know Homer Banks was my grandfather's brother, and he was a funny guy. And he and my sister used to laugh and cut up a lot. I just remember only one thing about him, and that he was always telling the story about Herman I don't know what it was. It was a worm. And he put his tongue between his teeth and his lip, and he said, "This is Herman the kangaroo." Herman the kangaroo. And he talked like that all the time, and he was just a lot of fun. That's all I know about him. So,
do you know what he did?
I have no idea. He lived in Battle Creek, Michigan, I think, by the Kellogg plant.
Do you know his wife's name?
No. Mrs. Banks.
Okay. Hugh Banks.
Hugh Banks is my grandpa, my mother's father. And if there's anybody I would probably say I could set on a pedestal, it was my Grandpa Banks. I could go on all night. I could write a book about him, but I won't do that. But he was a gentle giant. He was a dedicated Christian. He loved and cherished my grandma and was a terrific father, although there's something that happened in there that he and my Uncle Ralph did not hit it off. And Grandpa tried to fix that all his life, and it just didn't work. But Grandpa lost his arm working on the Nickel Plate Railroad. He was decoupling 2 trains, and his arm was in between, and they banged together and cut his arm off. He took his arm, which was a little bit attached to the other part of his arm, and carried it and yelled over to some little paper boys across the street to come over, and he said, "Would you please go get an ambulance or police or something?" And they looked at his arm, and it scared them so bad they took off running and never did anything. So he walked to the hospital, Of course, they couldn't attach it in those days. It was his left arm, and he was determined he was not going to let that stop him. And so he had 4 children, and he was going to provide for them. So he built a big 2-story house with one arm. And it's a beautiful, very well built home, still standing. And then he invented, by taking a car and built it into a bus called a jitney, which meant a nickel ride. And that was the first bus in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And he used to take it to the orphanages on Sunday and pick up children and take them to church and did all kinds of things like that. And he eventually got a shop in his backyard. He had built himself a single-car garage, and he needed a place to work because he wanted to sharpen lawnmowers and saws and stuff. So he cut the garage in half diagonally, set part of it, the one half, on broomsticks and rolled it to the place where he wanted it to be, and then he filled that in with wood and built it into a large garage and shop. And so he did sharpen lawnmowers and saws, and he had signs up in there that he'd cut out of little pieces of wood, letters all over his walls that said, "It is no secret what God can do. What he's done for others, he'll do for you." And then he had another wall that said something else similar to that. I don't remember what it was. He had a radio on in the garage that was always playing Christian music, and the children would come around there all the time just to talk to Grandpa, or Bopo as I called him. And he would sharpen their skates and things just for them, just to be kind. And then they'd come in and get a big buckets full of sawdust, and they'd fill their sandboxes. Instead of sand, they'd fill them with sawdust, and he would always have a bunch of that for them. He was just so special. The one thing he did that I thought was ornery as could be, but he was known for that. He got up on the roof one time, and Grandma was in the kitchen, and Marjorie was in the kitchen, and he was fixing the roof, the chimney. And he got finished fixing the chimney, fixing the bricks and everything, and he had a tarpaulin up there, and he decided he would throw that down to the ground before he came down. And so he threw it down right in front of the big window in the kitchen and screamed like he was falling. Of course, my grandma about had a heart attack, and my aunt's so concerned about Grandma. It was terrible. But then that goes along with the fact that when I'd go to visit them, they would tease me by saying, "Well, let's have some hot dogs for supper. Is that okay?" I'd say, "Yeah." And they'd say, "Okay, go out in the front and pick some. Bring them in for supper." And I'd say, "Hot dogs don't grow on trees." No, they grow on shrubs. They're out in the front of the house." And I'd go out there, and sure enough, they were there hanging on the shrubs, and I would pick them and bring them in. Of course, he set that up for me. Another time, he took a string and tied it on my new Christmas doll, ran the string up, or a thin piece of thread, ran it up through a cup hook in the ceiling, and then sat down in a chair with the other end of it and said, "Oh, Carolyn, is your doll dancing?" And then he'd pat one leg with his hand, which was tied to the string, and he would bounce that up and down, and he'd sing songs, and my doll would dance. I thought the world had just opened up for me. It was wonderful. That's the kind of grandpa he was. That's all.
Just a side note here. It Is No Secret was written by Stuart Hamblin, and I got to meet him at Kaimichi Clinic, and he was John Wayne's neighbor and was in John Wayne movies.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Ida Mae Snyder Banks.
Ida Mae was my grandma. That's Grandpa's wife, and they were married for well over 60 years. Excuse me. But she was a sweet, just like you picture your grandma, short, chunky, white hair, and just a tender little quiet lady. And I was a spunky kid. Of the 3 kids that my parents had, I was the spunky one, and Grandma wasn't quite sure how to deal with me sometimes. So I got punished a lot because I pulled pranks. So for a few years in there, she wasn't my favorite person, but after I got older, I got over that. She was a doll. I loved her. Um, it was so cute. She had a stroke. This isn't cute, I realize, but what happened was she had a stroke and it affected her mentally for about 13 years. And in that period of time, she could be cantankerous and not nice to Grandpa and stuff, and it hurt his feelings. But she uh, she had a bird, and the bird, well, the whole family had the bird, and it was uh, a parakeet, and they had taught it to say some things and everything, and so it also would sit on her shoulder. Well, she didn't want flowers in her house. She didn't want all kinds. She didn't want to hear the doorbell ring, and all those things were bothering her. But that bird never bothered her. And Marjorie would take curlers or bobby pins and put them in her hair and to fix her hair, and the bird would come over and peck at her hair and not do anything about it until he knew that it was dry, and then the bird would come and start picking out the uh, uh, bobby pins, and he'd drop the bobby pins on the floor, and then Grandma would get her hair combed. I always thought that was so cute. But the one thing is, Grandpa kept praying over and over a prayer that I didn't particularly understand, but my mom and everybody did, that he was praying that he would outlive Grandma so she didn't have to die, or so she didn't have to go through his funeral. And he prayed also that he'd see a ray of sunshine. And he just wanted to see Grandma as she used to be. Well, she got a fever. She got the flu, and she got the fever that acted upon her like a shock treatment. And for 48 hours, she was normal. And she would say things like, Aunt Margie said, what would you like to eat? And Grandma would say, oh, make me some rice. You haven't made rice for me for a long time. Margie would say, how did I do that? Put water in the pan and then dump the box in? And Grandma would say, you want rice all over the floor? Grandma knew everything. She was fine. And after 48 hours, she passed away. So Grandpa got both of his prayers answered that way. And it was just so special. But just another little added thing with that bird. It used to say, it'd get on Grandpa's foot, and he'd bounce his foot, and he'd say the name of his train, and he'd say, nickel plate, and the bird would go, nickel plate, and then they taught it to say Jiminy Cricket, and he'd say Margie, City Light, which is where she had worked. And one day the bird got all mixed up, and he goes, hot cricket. So it was just a fun little bird to have around the house. Okay, next one.
Jamie Haynes.
Jamie Haynes is a sad story. Jamie Haynes belonged to Shirley and Bill Haynes. They had 4 children, and I'm sorry to say they destroyed 4 children. It was Ronnie, Jamie, Tina, and Mary. They all ended up with very psychological problems. Jamie was the second one. Ronnie actually was Shirley's son, but not Bill's. And every picture you'd see Shirley and Bill and the 3 children, and then Ronnie sitting off on the side. He just never seemed to fit in at that time. As it turned out, Tina got pneumonia and was neglected with her pneumonia and slept in front of a broken window when it was raining and everything. And the welfare called us and asked us if we would consider taking her into our home. They said she has a little asthma. Well, since I already had a child that had asthma, Jeffrey, I thought, I know how to deal with that, so I can help her too. So little did they say that she had volumes of her, they didn't tell me this, of her illnesses. And she had a disease called bronchiectasis, which is similar to cystic fibrosis. And she came to us as a very, very sick little girl. So during that time, then, Jamie and Ronnie were needing a home. So different people in the church took them in, and at one time we did. Jamie went with Tony Thomas and Christy and stayed there for about a year. Then they were going to move away, and they wanted to adopt him, but the welfare said they were too young and they were going too far away, and they wouldn't let him adopt him. Well, Jamie has contacted the family many times since then. We've kept up with him a little bit, and Ronnie has tried to help him get back on his feet and everything, but he's an alcoholic and a druggie, and he and his father have been living on the streets of Cincinnati. I don't know whether that's where they are today, but it's just a sad story that we couldn't help. So that's all I know for Jamie right now.
Jerry Downey.
Jerry Downey, I already talked about. He's the one that my sister was married to first, and he was the minister at Hobart, Indiana. My father had been the minister at Hobart, Indiana first, and when my father passed away, then Jerry applied for the church and he got it. And I don't have a lot to say there.
Okay. Joyce Imler. Is it Imler or Imler?
Imler.
Imler, okay.
Joyce is one of my Aunt Gladys's daughters, and she's a very classy woman. She and her sister Peggy both. And I believe it was Peggy was also played in movies in the theater. And but they're both a lot alike. But I think it was Peggy that I keep forgetting. I get the girls mixed up, but I believe Peggy was driving her truck to the grocery store one day, and she had a fairly new Ford pickup truck. And she came home with the groceries in the back and pulled it up on her hill to her house. When she went to let the tailgate down, the truck let loose and rolled back and ran over her and killed her.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. She lived in California. She's just, like I said, a classy lady. She just dressed so pretty. And one of those things, when I was a little girl, I just always admired she and her sister. That's all.
Leslie Imler.
Leslie, I remember him. He was not a very tall guy, dark hair, real kind, but there was something wrong. I don't remember what happened, whether he had some kind of surgery and ended up in a wheelchair and didn't walk after that. But he and my brother were about the same age, and they were close. I think before whatever happened to him, before that happened, he and Delmer used to go on mountain climbing trips together. That's all I can remember about him.
Lindsay Owen Werner. That was Bev's daughter.
Oh.
Bev and Greg.
Okay. You threw me with the Werner. Okay. Lindsay was an adopted little girl that Bev and Greg adopted. Real sweet little girl. Grew up and got married, and then decided that the world was more interesting than her little boy and the rest of the family. So she ran off and lived the worldly life, and I don't know where she is now. And Beverly, her husband was in the service. So while he was in the service, Bev and Greg raised the little boy, and then when he got out of the service, he took over the raising of him.
Do you remember anything about her as a child or anything?
No. They lived in Illinois, and I just didn't get a chance to be around them much.
Lona Bean Banks Rogers.
That's my mama. Yeah, greatest woman on earth.
That's how my mom was.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you can say that. Right now, I'll stick to my mom. She's a tiny little lady. My daddy wasn't very big either. They made a cute couple. And
Your dad wasn't very big?
he's not very tall, no.
I didn't know that. Couldn't tell in the pictures.
About my height, I'd say. A little bit taller than me.
Okay,
But
go on.
anyway, my mother, speaking of being classy and dressing nice, mother made her clothes much of the time and did a beautiful job with it. She would make her hats and her dresses and purses to match, and of course then she'd buy shoes that matched, and she just always looked like she stepped out of a bandwagon or Vogue magazine. And when she was pregnant with my brother, she had one outfit to wear to church, and it was a black outfit, and all week long she'd wear my dad's shirts. But that town voted on the people who were best dressed, and my mother won that year with one dress and lots of jewelry. But mother had 3 children. It was Delmer and Ermely and I. And she was a great mother. The house was always spotless, which I did not follow in her footsteps very well. There was never a pin out of place. She was always ready for company. She always got up, tried to be dressed with makeup, and she wore little squatty heels and hose and dresses all day long in case somebody came to the house. She was always ready in the morning by the time the children were walking to school. That was her goal, to be ready by that time. And Daddy's shirts were always ready. He never had to stand around waiting for anything. And she just did a lot of good things. If you ate dinner at her house, it would be like dining. It was just beautiful. The table was always set up beautifully. Now, I won't say she was the best cook, but she made it look so good you thought it was good. And we always joked about that with Russell's mother. She was such a good cook, and Grandma Roop was such a good cook. They'd put on wonderful meals that tasted so good, but they didn't do anything fancy. So we had the choice of, do you want a fancy one or do you want a good one? But Mother was just a gentle, quiet woman, not at all like her kids, and like my dad. They're all joyful people, silly people. I remember the one time that we got such a kick out of Mother. It had been shortly after my dad passed away, and we'd gone to the North American Christian Convention. And Mother had been rather quiet because she was seeing all of her friends the first time without Daddy being there and everything. We went out to eat dinner at a restaurant, and at the end of the meal, the waitress came up and said, is there anything else I can do for you? And my mother said, yes, do you have carry-out service? And the woman said, sure, yeah, what would you like? And she said, would you carry me out? I ate too much. Well, when she said that we knew she was going to be okay, because we'd never heard her make jokes like that, and that was really funny for us, just coming from her. I could go on all day. I don't know what else to say, but she was...
Do you have an early memory or anything?
Well, she used to say, she'd introduce us. She'd say, this is Delmer. This is our son, Delmer. Now, how'd she say that? This is our son, this is our daughter, and this is Carolyn. Because I didn't seem to land in any particular... I wasn't the boy, I wasn't the girl. I was Carolyn. I had my own spot in life. That's not how she said it, but I can't remember how she said it. But anyway, she always said that children would sit so wiggly in church. It just drove her crazy, because she had my brother sitting on one side of her all dressed up in his little short pants and his polished shoes and carrying his little Bible, and one side my sister sitting on the other side with her patent leather shoes and her gloves on and her little purse with her money and handkerchief in it, and they didn't wiggle at all, and she couldn't understand why people would have to bring Cheerios to church and coloring books and crayons. And then I came along. And I don't know whether she'd prayed for patience or what, but she was going to get it then. And all of a sudden, Mother was taking coloring books and everything she could think of to church. In fact, one Sunday we were coming home from church, and we were walking home, and I said, "Daddy, your sermon wasn't long enough today." And he turned and looked at me like, "She's finally started listening." And my mother said, "Don't get too overjoyed here, Stuart. Uh, there's got to be a reason for her to say that." And he said, "Okay, why was my sermon not long enough?" I said, "Because I didn't get finished coloring my picture." So,
She was wise to you.
yeah, she was. She caught on.
Okay. Louise Wilfong Rogers.
Louise was my brother's wife, and they were married long over 50 years. Louise was just a sweetheart. They had 3 children, Cheryl, Gail, and Lauren. And there was a period of time that she worked in I believe it was a jewelry part of a department store. And she also made draperies. And she did very well at both. She was a good mother who stayed at home most of the time with the kids. She got Alzheimer's, and that's the one I was telling you about, was in the wheelchair and went to Disney World and stuff. But she was a very good minister's wife and really cared about the people. I remember one time she was sitting at a banquet, almost ready to deliver one of her children, and she ate too much supper, and she's sitting there amongst all these people, and she said, "Oh, I think my eyes are bigger than my stomach." And the man across from her says, "I don't think so." But I loved Louise. She was a doll. I took her when she was getting Alzheimer's and still able to get out some with Delmer. And we went into Frisch's one night, and she got up to go to the restroom. And Delmer said, "Carolyn, would you go with her? That restroom's too close to the front door, and I'm afraid she'll take off." So I got up and went with her. And when I came in, she was just getting ready to wash her hands. Although she didn't quite understand how to do that, I had to put her hands under the soap and stuff. She looked in the mirror and she said, "Oh, Carolyn, I want you to meet my new friend. She comes to my house all the time." And I looked up to see that she was talking to the woman in the mirror herself. And I had to play the part and say, "Oh, it's nice to meet you. Maybe I can see you at Louise's house sometime." But that's the sad things and the humorous things of Alzheimer's.